Hello and welcome to Kitchen Table Theology. I'm your host, Tiffany Coker. As a part of our Denominational Distinctive series, we're interviewing pastors and denominational leaders from many of the major denominations in order to learn their beliefs, their histories, and their theological distinctions. Today, we're diving into the Lutheran Church denomination. My dad, Pastor Jeff Cranston, had the opportunity to interview a special guest and friend, Pastor Erik Janke. Pastor Erik was born and raised in California. He decided to become a pastor at an early age. He attended Martin Luther College in Minnesota, then spent a year doing mission work in Russia, and then attended the Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary in Wisconsin, where he received a Master's of Divinity. In May of 2018, Pastor Erik was called to plant a church in Bluffton, South Carolina. He is still there now, currently the lead pastor at May River Lutheran Church. He's married to Amanda and they have 2 daughters. Let's go ahead and jump into the first part of their conversation. Again, with these interviews, this will be 2 parts. So today is the first half of their conversation and part 2 will be coming next week. Here's Pastor Jeff with Erik Janke. Thanks for joining us at the table.
Hello again, and welcome back to Kitchen Table Theology. This is Pastor Jeff Cranston. So good to have you back with us as we continue on in this series where we're talking to various leaders in a number of different denominations here in the U.S. We have talked about Presbyterianism and Anglicanism and Episcopalianism and Southern Baptist, and oh my, I feel like if I leave one out, I'm going to be doing someone a disservice. But you get the idea. A lot of other isms. And we're continuing today by talking to my friend and a fellow fire department chaplain here in Bluffton, South Carolina, named Erik Janke. And Erik is the pastor of the May River Lutheran Church and has been there for about 6 years. And I kind of hesitated on that because Erik is the founding pastor. So the first year, it was Erik and his family and laying a lot of the groundwork and doing a lot of the behind-the-scenes work to get things up and running so this church could begin. Erik, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about where you come from, your family, things like that.
Yeah. So grew up in California. My dad was a pastor, so I pretty early on decided that's kind of what I wanted to do. My brother did the same thing. He's a missionary, was over in Asia for a while. Now he's in Australia, but decided that's what I wanted to do. So went to college for Greek and Hebrew in Minnesota, took a year off, did a little bit of mission work in Russia, came back to seminary in Wisconsin, did an internship in Atlanta, and then we landed in Savannah. So the wife is a medical professional here in Bluffton, and we have 2 wonderful little girls, Evelyn, who's 4, and Penelope, who is 1.
Now, we have a fair number of Kitchen Table Theology listeners in the Atlanta area. What part of Atlanta were you in?
So we were outside the perimeter. We were OTP. We were in Peachtree City, which is kind of its own little bubble.
Sure.
If you're an Atlanta resident, you know kind of how different some of the suburbs are.
Yep, south side of the city.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, not too far from the airport. Peachtree City is a great area.
Yep.
Growing area. My goodness, it has exploded, like most things in Atlanta, in the last 20 to 30 years. Tell us the name of your seminary where you went in Wisconsin.
I went to Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary there, so that's been around for about 150 years. I think it really got its roots during the Civil War, and moved location a number of times, but ended up in Mequon, so just north of Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
I know that area extremely well from serving a 6.5-year sentence in Wisconsin over in Germantown. Well, Kitchen Table Theologian, we're going to talk about the Lutheran Church today, but as in many cases, the Lutheran Church is not just one denomination, at least in the U.S. And broadly speaking, when we're talking about Lutherans in America, we're talking about 3 main denominations, and they are the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which has been around since 1847. We've got the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod. Been around since about 1850, and that's the denomination that Erik is connected with. And then you've got the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. And my notes, Erik said, I'm looking at my notes here and saying established 1988. Is that?
Yep. That's so it was a recent merger. I'm going to get the alphabet soup wrong on here, but I think LCA and ALC perhaps, but a merger of two other Lutheran synods to form the ELCA. Yeah.
So that's what we're talking about. So, and Erik we'll probably ask him to speak generally regarding all three, but specifically, obviously, his particular branch of Lutheranism, which is the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod. It's sometimes called WELS. So we probably will refer to it as WELS because that'll save us probably about 20 minutes on the podcast, so we don't have to keep saying that name over and over again.
Yeah, I think so. It's kind of a mouthful.
So the name, Erik, the name Lutheran, tell us where that comes from.
So, yeah, this is really kind of the OG Protestant. You're going back to 1500s. You're going back to the Reformation. Of course, Luther wasn't the first reformer. You have fellows like Wycliffe and Huss, but this is really where the big Reformation happens. And so we wouldn't say we follow everything Luther teaches, right? Luther is not the head of the faith. It's Christ. And even Luther didn't want that name attached to him. And like a lot of names, it becomes kind of a derogative. Well, they're a Lutheran, they're a Luther follower. But sometimes the derogatives, they kind of stick, like Yankee, right? Something like that.
Right. And I think what I've done a fair amount of reading on Martin Luther and Kitchen Table Theologian. If you want to know a little bit more about the reformer Martin Luther, who was a Catholic monk, I don't think you may disagree or agree, Erik, I don't think he had any intention of branching out of the Catholic Church in the early days and starting another movement. He wanted to reform from within. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's why we call it the Reformation and not a revolution. We're not trying to start a new church. We're trying to reform the abuses that were in the church at the time. And so Luther never wanted this to happen, and it's easy for people to look back and think that when he's nailing those 95 theses on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany, that, this is some kind of political thing. Farthest from the truth. He just wanted to debate it. And at that point, a lot of his theology, it's not even really developed all the way. And he's still, some of these things are still a given for him because he's still a Catholic monk at the time. But some of that, as you read his writings later on, it progresses and develops a little bit.
There's I think probably the most well-known, most widely read biography of him was written by a man named Roland Blayton, and it's called Here I Stand. And he pulls that title of his book from Luther standing before the Diet of Worms when he was told to recant. And of all of his books that he had written were piled up on a table, and they asked him to distance himself, and he said, here I stand, I can do no other. And he wouldn't do that. I've got a book just behind me on my shelf that I've been reading over the last year because I was just so interested in his marriage to Catherine. I mean, they really had an incredible marriage, and she was quite a woman in her own right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, you have Katie von Bora or Katharina von Bora, who was formerly a nun and then gets married to Luther, and she's quite a capable woman. You read about everything she was doing for the Luther household, and then raising up their kids. And some would point to Luther as really kind of someone who begins public education and wants to educate the girls too, and just views all of this knowledge as just such a blessing. And so, there's so many things you can kind of trace back to Luther in our world today.
She's always reminded me of Abigail Adams, who was married to John Adams. And I don't think either of these men would have fully become who we know them to be without their wives. They were fully capable. I think Abigail probably would have made a better president and politician than John. It could be argued anyway, but that's another podcast for another time. But tell us a little bit. So you grew up as a PK, a pastor's kid. Is that how you came into the WELS denomination, or did you grow up Lutheran and came into your denomination later, or how did that work?
Yep, grew up Lutheran my whole life. Grandpa was a pastor in the same synod. Great-grandpa was a pastor in the same synod, maybe even the one before that. And then before that, I think it was a blacksmith that came over from Germany. So, yeah, they still have all the old yearbook pictures on the wall at the seminary. You can go back to 18-something and look at all of them. So, yeah, I think great-grandpa was a circuit rider out in South Dakota. And, this is during the Great Depression. They didn't have enough to pay him, so finally he had to quit. But that's back when you were paid with, potatoes and corn and literally whatever you could. But yeah, so it was kind of a natural move for me. I don't know if it's in the genetics or something, but yeah.
It sounds like it.
Yeah. So it's been a blessed vocation so far. So happy to be here.
Speaking of circuit rider preachers and how they got paid, I heard one old Baptist say one time he got paid in chickens one week and in feathers the next week. So you never knew if it was going to be a good offering or not.
Yep.
At what age did you take your first church or join the staff of a church? How did that happen for you?
Yeah, join the staff at a church. Yeah, so I remember Saturday nights we would always be kind of mischievous in the household while Mom was practicing organ, and we would kind of help out, even just putting the visitor cards back in. But I think first, official staff at a church, I think I was probably over in Russia, if you'd call that an official position, kind of a lay missionary, something like that. And then, did a little stint in Alaska, as we call him vicar. Vicar is just Latin for substitute, essentially an intern position, vicar in Alaska, and then Atlanta as well. But always felt natural to me, probably since age 4. I think my brother and I, we were watching these VHSs about, firemen and policemen, and he thought it'd be funny to kind of scare me about it. And, so he told me how dangerous this or that profession was. And I saw my dad at a desk, and of course he wasn't always at a desk. He was out, visiting people in the hospital or whatever. But I decided from that point on that seemed a little bit more risk averse, which suited my personality just fine. And, it was off to the races after that.
And so you've come up in it. How did you, in terms of salvation for you, was there a crisis moment in your life, or was it just something you grew up always believing, which obviously would make so much sense considering your background?
Yeah.
But was there, when did you come to a place where in your life where you placed your faith in Christ for your salvation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's not really something I've thought about, and we'll probably talk about it more when we talk about theology and in a little bit more depth. But this is just kind of always something. Sometimes Lutherans get knocked for being a little bit too cold emotionally, but I think maybe the flip side of that is we point to a lot of objectivity of this is Christ for you. And so I can't really point to a moment, I don't think. I still remember when I was 4 or 5, I didn't want to sing in Sunday school. And so there's probably a point at, 5 or 6 when I finally began to. I don't know if you'd call that the moment, but yeah, slowly but surely, and plenty of crises along the way where the faith develops. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, it was kind of just something instilled, yeah.
Yeah, and what a blessing to grow up in a home where Christ was honored. Yeah. And obeyed and proclaimed. Well, let's talk about your denomination, the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod. And one parenthetical question. You and I have used the word synod a few times. That's a church word if there ever was a church word.
Oh, yeah.
But not a lot of people know what that is. Could you define what a synod is for us?
Yeah, so synod just comes from 2 Greek words, syn or zin, and then hodos, which means way. So syn means with, and then way. So you're walking together, essentially. It's a group of people that were walking together doctrinally, theologically, all that. But so that's kind of the term that Lutherans used when they got over here, is they would have geographic synod. So there was the Buffalo Synod, which I think is the coolest name, but it was Buffalo, New York. It's not after the animal. And it was geographically bound. So you have that, you have Missouri Synod, you have Wisconsin Synod, and that only, really is talking about the founding of it. Where did it start? Where did all these kind of German immigrants start out? But funny story about it, my bishop or my supervising pastor in Atlanta, he would say, yeah, we're part of the Wisconsin Synod. And so there was one, wonderful Southern gentleman who he didn't really understand it. And sometimes, if you have kind of an accent, it's hard to understand. And so he kept calling him senator. And my supervising pastor, he was happy with the title of, being called senator, but he felt eventually he should disabuse him of that notion. Not a senate. Yeah. A synod. Yeah.
Well, I did not know that. Walking together.
Mm-hmm.
That's a beautiful term. What size is your denomination? In terms of how many people?
Last time I checked, I think it was about,
Sunday.
Let's see, 300,000, I think, is the whole denomination across America. And WELS has, different church bodies that we're in fellowship with, on all the different continents. And, we send out missionaries to, there's a little map out in the entryway, but dozens of countries.
So how about walking us through how things are structured?
Yeah, so we're pretty laid back about most of that. We don't have real hard doctrinal positions about church polity per se. So we will use different terms, so bishop, again, maybe a little bit different from how you would normally think about it. It's not real high church. This is generally just a supervising pastor. So if someone gets a vicar, sometimes you call him your bishop, or supervising pastor, you just call him pastor. But yeah, we have a headquarters out, kind of in Milwaukee-ish, and all sorts of different congregations. We could talk a little bit about some of the differences between denominations. It seems, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like Missouri has a little bit more from bottom up, a little bit more focus on the congregation and the congregation's not autonomy, but maybe authority. Wisconsin Synod is a little bit more top down. So we have district presidents, we have a synod president, all that.
So as a pastor of a local church, who are you directly accountable to?
So in general, we would have a circuit pastor, but there's not we generally don't look at the role in terms of accountability. Generally, that would be the district president who's in charge of kind of doctrinal oversight, and then also managing any kind of situations that might come up. That would go to the district president, but we're small enough that we all know him, can all talk to him at conference and all that. So pretty good relationship. Generally, you have, district presidents, and there's boards of appeals if something gets out of hand, something like that. Yeah.
So you all get together as pastors, district-wise, annually, or how does that work?
A couple times a year. It depends. Okay. So we'll have like a synod-wide leadership thing. I think next January or February we have one up in Chicago. But for the South Atlantic district that I'm a part of, we'll have a conference. We just had a conference on Joel in Baton Rouge. And then we'll have like one where we have pastors and teachers. We would consider all of them called workers, right? They're all part of the ministry. So we would get together, say in Florida, and worship together and learn together, if there's a certain topic that would be applicable, whether it's resilience in ministry, something like that. So yeah, it's small enough where you can really have a lot of connections with other pastors and folks in the same synod.
So the Wisconsin Synod meets in Florida. I think that's...
They can meet all over. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, sometimes I call it the mothership because we have so many churches back there. And some people, they're kind of like, all right, but we're in South Carolina, Wisconsin Synod. That sounds kind of weird. So sometimes we kind of drop that off. Sometimes we'll say we're a confessional Lutheran just to say that, hey, like we hold to a historic faith. We're not trying to make up anything new in the 21st century. Something like that. Yeah.
Let's suppose we attended May River Lutheran Church this coming Sunday, and you're there, and you've got your congregation walking in. We walk in.
Mm-hmm.
Walk us through a typical worship service. What could we expect? What would we experience?
Yeah, so as soon as you walk in, probably the first thing is, even though we're in a storefront, we still try to have certain elements that are there. And because Lutherans will talk, whenever you talk to a Lutheran, they'll probably talk about Word and Sacrament. So you're going to see a pulpit, you're going to see an altar, you're going to see a font. And again, we're kind of talking about this kind of objectivity to it, of this is where God promises to be found, so we want to keep that front and center. You would get a lot of Jesus, right? So this is liturgical. So from the beginning to end, we come in, we sing a hymn, and then we start with, it's kind of the baptismal formula, you might say. We call it the invocation sometimes, but why do I belong in God's house? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit? Because you're one of his kids, right? Those same words were spoken to you over your baptism. We confess our sins. We hear absolution from the pastor. Because the Spirit promises to work through the Word, we're going to read some lessons. We're going to read straight from Scripture. We will have a creed, right? Confess what the church has confessed for hundreds of years.
What creed do you normally use? Are you
go between
Nicene, Apostolic, Apostles' Creed? Or?
Yep. We'll do Nicene Creed. Generally, I do that on Communion Sundays, and then Apostles' Creed on non-Communion Sundays. On Trinity Sunday every year, though, we break out the Athanasian Creed. We don't always say all of it, but that one's
really lengthy.
For sure.
So is this something the congregation reads out loud together? Mm-hmm. So it's printed up. So we've got a bulletin or a worship folder or something like that. All that is printed out. So you sort of follow along as you go through. Okay.
Yep. And sometimes I remind the people, this isn't a prayer. You don't have to have your heads bowed down. We're saying it to each other. Generally, I preface it by saying, and now we confess the faith that we share using the words of, and those have kind of served as boundary markers for orthodoxy of people who believe in this is a triune God. Jesus is fully divine, fully man. And these are the things we hold to kind of inculcate that every time to find some unity there. And then after that, sometimes we'll have the Lord's Supper, but we always end in a blessing, sometimes a closing hymn as well. Sometimes that could be a little bit scripted when people come in, especially from different backgrounds. But I think C.S. Lewis had something he said about how church can kind of be like a dance. You got to get some of the basic steps down first, and then you can kind of enjoy it after that. And it may seem less spontaneous, but I know that when I'm confessing my sins, sometimes I kind of need a script, right? If you confront me and say, Eric, why did you do this? Well, my sinful nature, what is it going to want to do? It's going to want to blame someone else, right? So sometimes, having a script can help to be able to say, yeah, no, I have sinned in thought, word, and deed by my own fault, by my own grievous fault, or what have you.
And so that's part of the liturgy. So, we're saying this out loud as well. So this word of confession that I've sinned in thought, word, and deed. I haven't loved you. I haven't loved my neighbor as myself. That sort of terminology. Yeah. I use that quite often in my own private devotions. Yeah. I follow the last, I'd say 5 years, I follow personally a liturgical pattern in my own personal time with God in the morning. Are you saying the Lord's Prayer together?
Yep. Say the Lord's Prayer. Okay. I'm trying to think what else. Yeah. And I try to include little service notes because it's not super intuitive when you come to it for the first time. You're kind of wondering, well, why is this there? And why is this there? Maybe think of it as two masts on a ship. There are two big elements to the service. As Protestants, we make a big deal about the word. And then kind of as Lutherans, we also make a big deal of the table, of the sacrament. So those are kind of the two big things. And you can kind of see how it ramps up. You have your readings, you sing a psalm or you read a psalm, you have kind of a verse of the day, stand for the gospel. That goes back hundreds of years. Knights would lay down their swords, kings would take off their crowns out of, reverence for the words and works of Jesus. We stand and we listen to the words of Jesus. And then after that, generally, the offerings in the middle of the service, what they used to do is the offerings would be consecrated for the Lord's Supper. So, of course, you have to have the offering before that. And then you have the Lord's Supper, and then you have the Aaronic blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. Lord, make his face shine upon you. Be gracious to you.
So musically, you're singing hymns. What kind of instrumentation do you have?
So it really varies. Right now, we're kind of bound by it. We're a pretty small congregation. So generally, it'll be like a piano track or something like that. But again, we're pretty laid back on a lot of that. So at seminary, we had kind of like a bluegrass quartet. That was really, really great to sing some of the old hymns like Rock of Ages to. As you go to different Lutheran churches, there's a big variety. And this kind of goes back to the Reformation. Luther wanted to reform things to keep things in, but he also understood, if you look at the organ used to, what did they call that? Like the instrument of the devil. This is like 1300 years ago, though. So it's an understanding that God can be glorified, with all different instruments. And especially as you get some world mission experience, I think you can kind of appreciate that more of, hey, other people, other parts of the world, incredibly pious. They love Jesus just as much, if not more, and they're going to glorify him in this way. So all sorts of variety, but generally piano and organ, we want something that accompanies because we make a big deal. We want the congregation to sing to each other, right? To encourage each other. Sometimes we talk about 4 dimensions of worship of it's not just me giving praise to God. It's also God giving his gifts to me. It's me witnessing to a visitor who may have come in. And it's also me affirming the people who are there, the members who are there in that unity of faith that we have, yeah.
Thanks so much for listening to the Kitchen Table Theology Podcast with Pastor Jeff Cranston. We're going to pause right here. This interview is going to be 2 separate episodes. So we will pick up right at this spot in Pastor Jeff and Pastor Erik's conversation next week. and continue learning about the Lutheran denomination. If you're enjoying the podcast, would you take just a second to leave a rating or review? We really do appreciate your help in getting the word out. You can check out today's episode notes and more at jeffcranston.com. You can also email us anytime at pastorjeff@lowcountrycc.org. As always, thanks are due to our friends at Low Country Community Church here in Bluffton, South Carolina, for making this podcast possible. Until next time, always remember that the real power of theology is not only knowing it, but applying it. Thanks for joining us at the table.